The misfortune of the handsome boy. When beauty becomes a sacrifice of power in the Roman Empire of 65 AD, in the Golden Palace of Emperor Nero, 16-year-old free citizen Sporus was undergoing a torture that transcended the understanding of his time. This young man, renowned for his androgynous beauty, was chosen by the emperor as a human-shaped sacrifice because of his resemblance to Poppaea, the second wife of Nero who had died. A cruel experiment driven by power is grinding human nature into dust. In his biography of Nero, the ancient Roman historian Suetonius recorded, "The emperor gazed into Sporus's eyes, and what was reflected in those pupils was the appearance of Poppaea before her death." This pathological obsession gave rise to a shocking plan. Nero ordered the court physicians to castrate. Among the graffiti discovered by archaeologists in the ancient city of Pompeii, there is a mural depicting Nero and Sabina riding in a chariot. In the painting, commoners point at the figures inside the chariot, with the caption, "Look, that's the Roman emperor and his female favorite." But the female favorite was originally male. This kind of folk ridicule reflects the collapse of the moral foundation of the empire. The operation lasted for 6 hours, and the blood seeping from the wound sutured with gold thread on the marble operating table stained the purple robe symbolizing imperial power red. To maintain his beauty, Nero ordered the imperial physicians to treat him with a mixture of opium, when the emperor could freely alter the gender, identity, and even the meaning of life of others. The collapse of the Roman Empire had already been foreshadowed. Nero proved the iron law that absolute power leads to absolute corruption with the pain of when society tacitly allows rulers to regard others as puppets that can be transformed at will, and defense of human nature are the cornerstones of the survival of civilization. The moral foundation of the entire civilization has already collapsed. The enlightenment this tragedy leaves to future generations lies in, and Mercury, which led to the loss of his teeth and the ulceration of his skin. His tears are colder than the Tiber River. This history soaked in blood will eventually become the sword of Damocles hanging on the peak of all power, warning future generations that when power loses its reverence for human nature, destruction has already begun. The collapse of the Nero dynasty was essentially the comprehensive erosion of human nature by the alienation of power, from the castration of young men to the burning of Rome when power loses its restraint. Any individual may become a sacrifice to the perverted desires of the ruler. Today, in the Commarcabitorio Museum in Rome, there is still a fragment of a relief engraved with the face of In the eyes of the young man on the relief there is no royal glory, only a faint glimmer of humanity crushed by power. This faint glimmer, having traversed 2,000 years, has become the sharpest accusation against all authoritarian rule, from the killing of mothers and marriage to the rampant tyranny. This once glorious empire eventually collapsed on the ruins of morality. Ironically, after getting drunk, Nero said to Sphinx, "You are more obedient than Poppaea because you have no will of your own." This complete denial of human nature eventually backfired on Nero himself. In 68 AD, when the rebels were approaching Rome, Nero attempted to have Sporus die in his place. But the already tortured and on the verge of death young man could not even raise his scepter. The elders were forced to shout, "The bride is so beautiful," while the commoners below secretly passed on pottery shards that read, "Look, Rome is marrying a castrated boy." This wedding was essentially Nero's opium, trampling on the ethics of the empire. He used his power to forcibly transform a man into a substitute for his deceased wife and alien marriage into a tool to satisfy perverted desires. What was even more terrifying was that Nero later took Sabina on a tour of Greece, having him ride in a golden palanquin to receive the worship of the people. Through the gap in the palanquin curtain, the empty eyes of the young man, paralyzed by drugs, emerged. Even more ironically, the surgical tools were cast by melting the jade hairpin that Poppaea had loved most during her lifetime. The madness of power reached its absurd peak at this moment. 2. Marital farce. The tampered gender and the moral decline of the empire. After this inhumane operation, Nero changed Sporus' name to Sabina and forced him to wear the dowry of Poppaea, a silk wedding dress inlaid with 136 pearls. In the Roman square of 66 AD, an unprecedented royal wedding was taking place. Nero played the groom, a crushed young man wearing a golden veil played the bride, and a eunuch, disguised as the witness, recited the altered wedding vows. Cassius Dio described this strange scene in the history of Rome. When Nero put the wedding ring on Sabina. 3. Power backlash. From puppets to omens of empire collapse. The tragedy of Sporus is not an isolated event, but a microcosm of the systematic decline of the Nero dynasty. Medical historians' research on the court archives of Nero's time has found that Sporus suffered from severe septic shock after his surgery. 4. Historical mirror image. When absolute power devours human nature, Sporus' experience reveals an eternal proposition in political philosophy: absolute power inevitably leads to absolute corruption. Contemporary historians, when analyzing this period of history, point out the tragedy of Sporus is not an individual misfortune, but an inevitable product of institutional evil. The blood-stained revelation, the human warning bell salvaged from the ruins of Rome. The story of Nero and Sporus is essentially the ultimate test of human nature by power. Warning of the boundaries of power, asterisk. Any unrestrained power will lead to self-destruction. The bottom line of human dignity, asterisk. The value of historical memory, the tragedy of Sporus, should not be forgotten, for it constantly reminds humanity that vigilance against power. Among the ruins of the Colosseum in Rome, there is still a folk song about Sporus that has been passed down to this day. The handsome young man in the Golden Palace was turned into a weeping doll by power. When the sun sets in Rome,